The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in a fluorescent cage. Rachel Torres pushed a cart of 4 supplies down the ICU corridor at Seattle General, her scrubs still damp from the early morning rush, the smell of antiseptic and old coffee clinging to everything. 3 months as a temp nurse. 3 months of being invisible. That was the plan. She was good at invisible. The badge clipped to her pocket caught the harsh white light as she moved, nothing remarkable on it, just a name and a temp designation that meant the permanent staff barely looked at her. She'd counted on that. Counted on the hierarchies and the noise and the endless rotation of faces that kept hospitals running but also kept people from seeing what was actually in front of them. Rachel had learned to move through spaces like that the way water moves through a sieve, present, necessary, forgotten. The intercom crackled. Code blue, Trauma Bay 1. Then, incoming trauma, critical GSW complications, ETA 8 minutes. She heard the shift in the unit. Doors opened. Nurses moved faster. But Rachel kept stocking supplies with the same measured pace. Her hands never trembled. They'd held too many lives together for that. She sorted 18-gauge needles into the plastic organizer, each movement precise, economical. Combat training had taught her that panic burned calories you didn't have in the field. The habit had stuck. A stretcher burst through the ICU doors. Commander James Hewitt was the color of wet concrete. His chest was wrapped in surgical bandaging, blood seeping through the outer layer in a slow, deliberate pattern that meant something had already gone wrong once and was going wrong again. His left arm was wrapped from shoulder to wrist. His face was slack, jaw hanging open as the ventilator did the work his lungs wouldn't do. The monitor above his bed showed vitals that looked like a stock market crash, BP 89/52 and dropping, heart rate 128, O2 sat already slipping from 91 down toward 88. Ramadi wounds. That's what she heard one of the ER nurses say. Emergency surgery for shrapnel that had embedded itself in places surgeons hated to dig. Complications from the repair. His body was fighting back against what the scalpel had done to save him. Rachel watched them wheel him into the far bay. She didn't move toward him. Didn't need to. Not yet. The attending would manage the crisis protocol. The surgical team would swarm. Rachel knew this choreography from the inside out, had performed it in field hospitals where the supplies were improvised and the triage decisions fell to whoever was standing and conscious. But here, in a civilian hospital, she was just the temp stocking supplies. Invisible was safer. Then she saw it. Around Hewitt's neck hung a dog tag on a broken chain. Just one. Most soldiers wore 2, one for the body bag, one for the records. This one was singular, damaged, the chain split at the clasp like it had been torn or cut. Rachel's hand stopped moving. She set down the 4 kit she'd been holding. The tag caught the light as the nurses moved Hewitt's body into position. The engraving wasn't visible from where she stood, but she didn't need to see it. Her body already knew. 20 years was a long time. 20 years was forever. But some memories didn't fade. Some memories lived in the hands, in the bones, in the part of the brain that processed trauma before the conscious mind could catch up. Rachel walked toward the bay. Her pace was unhurried. Her expression was blank. But every cell in her body was moving toward that bed like iron to a magnet. She could see the bandaging now, see the specific pattern of the surgical closure, a field repair, not elegant but effective. Whoever had done the surgery in the OR had learned from someone who knew combat medicine. Rachel could read it in the sutures. She moved to the head of the bed. The tag hung just below the collar of the gown they'd put him in. The chain was military-grade stainless steel, the kind that didn't break easily. This one had been deliberately separated, the clasp forced. Rachel reached out and let the dog tag rest on her palm. Her fingers didn't shake. Nothing about her moved except her eyes, which traced the worn surface of the metal. 7 years old. Kidia had been 7 years old. Ramadi, spring of 2004, outside the city proper where the fighting was supposed to be lighter but wasn't. They pulled him from a collapsed building with shrapnel embedded in his chest cavity like someone had opened him up and filled him with broken metal. Rachel had been Captain Rachel Torres then, Army Special Operations Combat Medical, and she'd spent 43 minutes digging that shrapnel out of a 7-year-old's chest while his mother held the fall line because there was no one else and the boy was hemorrhaging and time was the only drug that mattered. She'd given him this tag when it was over. Pressed it into his small hand, a promise, though she'd never said it out loud. A promise that she'd held him together. A promise that he'd made it. A promise that he was worth saving. That boy would be 27 now. The man on the bed was 28, maybe. The face was unconscious, slack, wrong. But the build was right. The hands were scarred in ways that matched combat. And the tag was hers to give and his to keep. Nurse Torres. Dr. Ashford's voice came from behind her, and Rachel's hand released the tag. It swung back against Hewitt's chest. She turned with the same measured movement, her expression neutral, her eyes flat. Ashford was tall, maybe 60, the kind of surgeon who'd spent enough years in private practice to believe his hands were infallible. His scrubs were the expensive kind, they cost more than Rachel made in a week. His watch was visible below the sleeve, something that caught light and probably cost what she made in a month. He moved through the hospital like he owned it. "Doctor," Rachel said. "What are you doing here?" "Monitoring vitals." "That's not your assignment." "Your inventory." Rachel didn't respond. She turned back to the monitors. The O2 sat had dropped to 86. The blood pressure was still falling. Someone needed to call the attending back in. Someone needed to prepare for a crash that was coming the way thunder follows lightning, not maybe, when. "I said that's not your assignment," Ashford repeated. Rachel kept her eyes on the monitor. "Saturation is dropping. The vent settings might need adjustment. I'll handle this unit. Return to your inventory." She waited 1 breath. 2. Then she turned and walked back to her cart. Her hands resumed their work exactly where they'd stopped. For kits. Syringes. Everything in its place. Everything where you could find it when you needed it fast. Behind her, she heard Ashford move to the head of the bed. She heard him check the ventilator settings. She didn't hear him notice the tag. But she felt it. The weight of it. The impossible fact of it. The way the universe had suddenly collapsed from being infinitely large into the size of a dog tag on a broken chain. Rachel moved through the rest of the shift like she was underwater. Her body performed the necessary tasks, restocking, organizing, moving between stations. But her mind was elsewhere, in a field hospital that didn't exist anymore, holding a 7-year-old boy whose lungs were trying to fail. She'd pulled him back from that edge. She'd given him 15 years of life as a free man, as a soldier, as someone with a future. And now he was in this hospital. Broken again. Hanging between survival and the thing that comes after. At 03:46, during the night shift change when the unit was quieter, Rachel stood beside Hewitt's bed again. Just long enough to look at the tag. Just long enough to confirm what her hands already knew. The engraving was worn but legible. Her name. The date. Her call sign. Angel 6. The name she'd used when she'd been real. Dr. Ashford arrived at the nurse's station at 6:24 a.m. with a folder and a cold smile. He didn't speak to Rachel directly. He spoke around her, to the charge nurse, loud enough that everyone working the ICU could hear. "Ms. Torres will be transitioning to overnight rotations effective immediately. Night shift. 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. I've also restricted her ICU access, she'll be reassigned to post-op recovery." The charge nurse blinked. "But she's been scheduled for. I'm the attending physician," Ashford said. "I've made the call." He left the folder on the desk and walked away, leaving Rachel standing there with a blood pressure cuff in one hand and the quiet certainty that she'd just been strategically dismantled. Overnight rotations meant isolation. It meant she'd work when the skeleton crew was on duty, when there were fewer witnesses, fewer allies. It meant she wouldn't be able to see Hewitt during daytime rounds when the floors were full of doctors and consultants. Ashford had just cut her off from the patient, from the boy who'd grown into the man whose dog tag still hung beneath her scrubs. It was a calculated move, precise as a surgical strike. She didn't argue. She nodded once, clocked out early, and drove home through rain that hammered the windshield like applause for a performance she didn't want to give. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, during the morning handoff, Dr. Ashford orchestrated her public execution. He waited until Hewitt's family was in the room, waited until his wife, his adult daughter, and his elderly mother were all standing there, until they were vulnerable and invested and watching the man in the bed with the kind of love that makes you believe in miracles. Then Ashford walked in, medical chart in hand, and his voice was a knife wrapped in professionalism. "We need to discuss some concerning behavioral patterns," he announced, addressing the family as if Rachel weren't standing 3 feet away. "This nurse has demonstrated an inappropriate emotional attachment to the commander. She's been found standing motionless beside his bed, staring at his belongings. She's violated protocols, inserted herself into his case in ways that are frankly concerning." He turned to Rachel. "You're a temp, correct? No permanent position here." She didn't flinch. "That's correct, doctor. And yet you're acting as though this patient is somehow personally significant to you." His eyes were flat. "That's not professional nursing. That's something else entirely. That's obsession wearing a stethoscope." The family went silent. The mother's hand gripped the bed rail. Ashford's voice dropped lower, more intimate, more poisonous. "I wonder if you should be in this room at all." He smiled at the wife. "We can certainly arrange alternative care if you'd feel more comfortable. Some of our nurses maintain appropriate boundaries." Rachel stood there, breathing in and out. One measured breath. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She met Ashford's eyes and then looked away, not in shame, but in the way someone looks away from something beneath their notice. He waited for her to crumble. He waited for her voice to shake, for tears, for pleading. She gave him nothing. The silence in the room became its own accusation. "I'll arrange the paperwork," he said finally, because he needed to fill the silence he'd created. He left with the chart tucked under his arm and the family staring at Rachel with the kind of doubt that poison plants in fertile ground. That morning, Rachel sat alone in the break room during her lunch break. She'd brought a salad. She didn't eat it. She sat at the small plastic table by the window and watched the rain streak down the glass. 2 of the nurses she'd shared coffee with that morning walked in. They saw her. They didn't approach. One whispered something to the other. They gathered their things from their lockers, deliberately, slowly, making sure Rachel noticed, and left without a word. Then another pair. Then another. By the time she sat there for 15 minutes, the break room had emptied around her like water draining from a sink. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. One tear, no more. She took one measured breath, set her untouched salad in the trash, and stood up. That's when she saw Ashford in the doorway. He was watching her, waiting for something. Waiting for her to shatter. Waiting for her to apologize, to beg, to prove that he'd broken her. She met his eyes, and her voice came out steady, each word placed like a surgical instrument. "I've been dismissed by better men than you, doctor." She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then she brushed past him toward the hallway. He looked away first. Rachel returned to her rounds with the quiet dignity of someone who'd survived far worse than hospital politics. She checked vitals. She documented intake. She replaced 4 bags and logged medication times. She moved through the corridors like someone who'd learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you could do was show fear. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm when she spoke to patients. The temporary badge clipped to her scrubs caught the fluorescent overhead light as she moved, glinting like proof of something no one else could see. Ashford watched her work that afternoon. He stood at the nurse's station and observed her moving between rooms with the kind of precision that belonged to someone far more trained than a 3-month temp should be. She hadn't cracked. She hadn't wilted. If anything, her composure had somehow made her more threatening. She was a threat because she didn't react. She was a threat because she seemed to belong to a different world entirely, one where his authority meant nothing. That's when he made his decision. He went to his office and began scheduling the staffing rotations for the next code blue emergency. He made sure the ICU would be understaffed at 0300 on the shift when Rachel was supposed to work the recovery ward 2 floors down. He made sure there would be no backup. He made sure that if something went wrong, if something catastrophic happened to a patient under his watch, there would be no experienced nurses nearby to salvage it. He was going to isolate her completely. He was going to set conditions where she couldn't help, couldn't intervene, couldn't prove whatever it was about her that made him feel like he was standing in the shadow of someone far bigger than himself. He didn't know what was about to walk through those doors at 0300. He didn't know that in exactly 72 hours, the night that would define his entire career, and end it, would begin with a flatline beep that echoed through an understaffed ICU like a death knell. The code blue alarm split the night at 0306. A single sustained wail that traveled through concrete and steel and the bones of everyone who heard it. Rachel was 2 floors down, restocking the supply closet on the 4th floor med-surg unit, when that sound found her. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in field hospitals and forward operating bases and in the moment right before everything went catastrophic. She didn't hesitate. The supply box hit the tile. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory older than her current identity propelling her toward the stairwell. 14 steps down. Push through the door. Corridor to ICU entrance. Badge still on her neck from the shift Ashford had deliberately understaffed, night rotation with 3 nurses covering 22 patients because he'd made the calls, pulled the strings, arranged for the adequate staff to be reassigned to other units. The ICU doors hissed open. The scene inside was controlled chaos collapsing into panic. Hewitt's room, the corner isolation unit where he'd been stable 6 hours ago, was now a storm of motion and stillness all at once. The crash cart stood abandoned near the nursing station, its drawers half open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. A first-year resident named Morrison, barely 26, stood at the foot of Hewitt's bed with both hands raised to his temples, staring at the monitor with the look of someone who'd just watched gravity stop working. The monitor screamed. Flat line. A single dead line traversing left to right like the end of a sentence. Blood pressure 70/40 and dropping. Someone called from across the room, one of the night nurses trying to maintain composure, her voice pitched high enough to crack. We're losing him. Rachel's eyes went to Hewitt in the bed. Commander James Hewitt, unconscious, his chest heaving in irregular gulps. The surgical dressing across his ribs was darkening, not just with sweat but with blood, fresh blood, the kind that meant the careful sutures were failing, the wound reopening in real time. She saw it before anyone else did. The sucking sound. Barely audible beneath the alarm, but there a wet, rhythmic intake, like someone breathing through a straw packed with fluid. Pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax. His collapsed lung was pushing against his heart with each breath, and his heart was losing the fight. Get the crash cart, Rachel said. Not a question. Not a request. The voice that came out of her wasn't the voice of a temp nurse in her 4th week at Seattle General. It was a voice that had issued commands in operating theaters where the walls shook from nearby explosions, where the only light came from field lamps and the only sound was the hiss of equipment keeping people alive. Morrison's head snapped toward her like he'd been slapped. I've got this. You're frozen. She was already moving. Get the cart. Now. He moved. Not because he understood the authority in her tone, but because something in the way she said it made disobedience impossible. The crash cart wheels squeaked against the tile as Rachel reached the bedside. Hewitt's skin was waxy pale, his pupils blown wide, the look of someone whose body was shutting down in real time, conservation mode, the human body's last negotiation with death. She pulled the dressing back. There it was, the wound site where the emergency surgery had been closed, the sutures holding by threads, and underneath them, the ragged edges of where the shrapnel had carved through his chest cavity 20 years ago in Ramadi, only this time it had reopened during his recovery, tissue tearing loose from the initial trauma, the body remembering what the mind tried to forget. 14-gauge needle, she said. Midclavicular line, second intercostal space. Hand it to me now. The nurse, Richardson, she'd seen her in the break room, fumbled through the crash cart with trembling fingers. Found it. The needle gleamed under the fluorescent light like something meant for surgery, clinical and precise. Rachel's hands moved on their own. 18 years of muscle memory that didn't belong to a temp nurse in Philadelphia. Her fingers found the space between Hewitt's ribs with the accuracy of something practiced 1,000 times in field conditions, in darkness, under fire, with a patient who couldn't be allowed to die because there was no backup, no second team, no other option. She didn't think about it. Thinking was the enemy. Thinking made hands shake. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, through skin and fascia and into the pleural space with a soft resistance that felt like coming home. The hiss of air escaping, pneumothorax decompressing, the pressure that had been crushing Hewitt's heart releasing like a held breath finally let go. "O2 sat," she said. 68, Morrison answered, his voice smaller now, a child's voice. Dropping fast. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Then, rhythm. A blessed, regular rhythm, returning like a heartbeat resuming after drowning. She watched the numbers climb. Oxygen saturation, the number that meant survival. The only number that mattered. 68. The baseline horror. 72. Climbing. 79. The needle had worked. 85. Hewitt's skin was already shifting from waxy grey back toward human color. 88. His breathing became less frantic, less the gasping of a drowning man. 92. Stable. Still critical, but no longer dying in the next 60 seconds. The room exhaled. For 18 years, Rachel Torres had been a temp nurse at Seattle General, working 3-month contracts, moving through the hospital like a ghost that wasn't supposed to be there. But in that moment, standing over Commander James Hewitt with a needle in her hand and his blood pressure climbing back toward acceptable, she wasn't a ghost anymore. She was something else entirely, something that had survived 3 tours of duty in forward operating positions, something that had learned medicine in field hospitals where the textbook didn't apply because the textbook assumed you had equipment, assumed you had time, assumed you weren't 40 kilometers from backup with mortars landing in the distance. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. The tremor in her fingers wasn't fear. It was restraint, the tremor of someone holding back something vast and trained and dangerous, keeping it contained just enough to function in a hospital where no one understood what she was. The monitor kept beeping. Normal rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Beautiful, boring, life-sustaining sinus rhythm. Good work, Morrison whispered, his voice smaller than before. I froze. I froze and you just. Get a second line in, Rachel said. Type and cross for 6 units. He's still bleeding internally and the dressing's compromised. We need to get him back to surgical before the bleeding accelerates again. She was already moving toward the door to call it up to the surgical floor, already reaching for the phone, already thinking 3 steps ahead like someone who'd spent half her life in triage protocols where the next decision meant the difference between someone walking away and someone getting zipped into a bag. The night nurse, Richardson, was staring at her like she'd just watched someone speak in a language that shouldn't exist. How did you know? Richardson asked. How did you know it was the lung? Rachel didn't answer. She was already calling surgical, already requesting the operating suite, already doing the 1,000 small things that kept a critical patient moving toward the possibility of survival instead of the certainty of death. What neither of them knew was that in exactly 4 hours, when the sun came up and the day shift arrived and the hospital began to function again under normal light, Dr. Ashford would arrive to find Rachel standing in the ICU, covered in Hewitt's blood, and he would understand with complete clarity that his attempts to isolate her, to restrict her access, to keep her away from this patient, had failed. What happened next ended careers. Ashford appeared at 0318, 12 minutes after the monitors settled into something resembling a rhythm. He stood in the doorway of the trauma bay, his face cycling through disbelief, calculation, and then something harder, the look of a man watching his carefully constructed walls crumble in real time. Rachel was still at Hewitt's bedside, her gloved hand steady as she checked the chest seal she'd fashioned from the MRE packaging, watching the rise and fall of his chest with the focused attention of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Her scrubs were soaked with blood that wasn't hers. Ashford's eyes moved from her to the monitor to the needle decompression site, and in that 3-second assessment, he understood exactly what she'd done and what it meant. He didn't move toward the bed. Instead, he turned and spoke into his radio with the voice of a man issuing a command that could not be questioned. Security to Trauma Bay 3. Now. The words crackled through the speaker like a judge's gavel. Rachel didn't look up from her work. She didn't need to. She could feel the machinery of institutional power beginning to turn, could hear the mechanical purpose in his voice. This wasn't a conversation, it was a takedown structured to look like protocol. 2 security officers arrived in under 90 seconds, their uniforms creating a physical wall between Rachel and the patient. Ashford stepped into the bay with his tablet already open, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone reading from a script he'd written long before the code blue alarm ever sounded. Ms. Torres, you violated protocol by entering this patient's room without authorization during your assigned downtime. You've performed procedures outside your scope of practice. This constitutes a direct violation of hospital policy and state nursing regulations. The words hung in the fluorescent lit air like a condemnation. He wasn't asking questions. He was documenting a decision he'd already made. Rachel finished securing the seal, her movements unhurried. She peeled off her gloves with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned that speed could be mistaken for guilt. Needle decompression, she said quietly, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Tension pneumothorax. O2 saturation was 68. She turned to face him, and Ashford saw something in her eyes that made him take a small step back, not fear, not anger, but the absolute certainty of someone who knew she'd done the right thing and didn't care who disagreed. He was dead. Now he's not. Ashford's face hardened. That's not your decision to make. He nodded to the security officers, a gesture that carried the weight of institutional authority. Please come with us, Ms. Torres. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the language of politeness, which made it somehow worse. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't appeal. She simply pulled off her isolation gown, dropped it into the biohazard bin with the precision of someone filing a document, and walked between the security officers without a backward glance. Ashford followed them into the hallway, already on his phone before the trauma bay doors had fully closed. His voice dropped low, but Rachel could hear every word as they moved through the corridor. Yes, this is Dr. Ashford at Seattle General. I need to report a nursing credential issue. I need to initiate a formal investigation into a temporary employee named Rachel Torres. Get me the state board chair. I don't care if it's 3 in the morning. By the time Rachel reached her locker in the changing room, Ashford had made 3 calls. She knew because he followed her there, tablet in hand, his expression wearing the grim satisfaction of a man who decided to burn everything down rather than admit he'd been outplayed. The hospital's legal department was now involved. The state nursing board had been contacted. A formal write-up had been filed not just with HR but posted on the ICU unit board, a public documentation of her alleged misconduct, visible to every staff member who came through that door. But the suspension notice came at 0447, hand-delivered by Ashford himself, accompanied by 2 security officers and a hospital administrator who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Rachel was sitting in the break room, having spent the last hour in a surreal quiet, watching the sun begin to think about rising somewhere beyond the city's edge. Ashford placed the letter on the table in front of her with the ceremonial care of someone laying down a gauntlet. Effective immediately, he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of institutional power, you are suspended pending investigation. Your badge is being deactivated. You'll surrender it now. Hospital security will escort you from the premises. Rachel picked up the letter without reading it. She already knew what it said. She'd read versions of this document in different wars, different countries, different lifetimes. She unclipped her badge from her scrub pocket and set it on the table next to the letter. "Now," she said, meeting Ashford's eyes for a single second before looking away, "we both know the truth about what just happened in that bay. And we both know why it's not in your interest to admit it." Ashford's face flushed, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. To acknowledge that she'd been right was to admit that he'd been wrong, and men like Ashford couldn't afford that kind of honesty. Instead, he turned and left, the security officers following him like satellites orbiting a dying star. One of them, a younger man with something like compassion in his eyes, walked Rachel to her locker. She cleared it methodically. Her personal phone. A photograph of a unit insignia she shouldn't have kept. A jar of caffeine pills from a deployment she'd tried to forget. Everything fit into a cardboard box that security provided, small and brown and final. That evening, standing alone in the hospital laundry room at 1951, Rachel Torres folded her scrubs for the last time. The industrial detergent burned her throat as she worked, the chemical smell of bleach and industrial cleaner mixing with something else, the smell of endings, of a door closing that might never open again. Her hands moved through the familiar motions: align the shoulders, fold the sleeves, crease the body, fold the pants leg by leg. Her hands had held classified secrets across 3 continents, had tied tourniquets on soldiers who didn't make it home, had palmed the dog tag of a 7-year-old boy in a field hospital outside Ramadi and pressed it into a small fist with a prayer she no longer believed in. Those same hands were now folding scrubs in a hospital basement, erasing Rachel Torres the nurse from existence. She smoothed each crease with precision, her movements methodical and measured. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its monotonous song. No one else was in the laundry room. No one else was watching. She was alone with the ghost of a civilian life that had lasted exactly 3 months before the past found her and pulled her under. Each fold was deliberate, was a small act of order imposed on chaos, was her way of saying goodbye to the person she'd tried to be. Her fingers traced the seams, pressing wrinkles out with the same hands that had once held a child's ribs open while shrapnel fragments were extracted, one by one, in darkness lit only by a glow stick and the terrible necessity of war. She placed the folded scrubs in the return bin, the last physical evidence of her time at Seattle General disappearing beneath layers of other people's uniforms, other people's shifts, other people's normal lives. The industrial laundry bin smelled like a tomb. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where her scrubs had been, and felt something inside her settle into a kind of stillness that civilians might mistake for resignation but which soldiers recognized as the moment right before you stop hoping and start planning. Her phone was in her pocket. No messages. No calls. The world had already moved on. Dr. Ashford was probably in his office, filing the paperwork that would erase her from the hospital's records. Commander Hewitt was in the ICU, his oxygen saturation stable at 94%, his heart beating in the rhythm she'd restored. In another life, in a timeline where she'd stayed invisible, she might have asked to check on him one last time. But that life was closed now. She walked toward the exit, and in the parking garage, she sat in her car for 47 minutes without turning the key. The rain started sometime around 0221. Drumming on the roof like 1,000 small accusations. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the specific tremor that comes from holding everything together for so long that the moment you stop holding, your body forgets how to function without the tension. She gripped the steering wheel and breathed, in and out, the way they trained her to do in the field hospitals and forward operating bases and the 1,000 small nightmare moments that had forged her into what she'd become. The dog tag hung around her neck beneath her shirt, the broken chain pressing cold metal against her sternum. She almost reached for it. Almost pulled it out. Almost threw it out the window into the rain because what was the point of carrying symbols when you were nobody anymore? What was the point of remembering when the world had decided you should be forgotten? She was a suspended nurse with no credentials. She was a woman in a parking garage in Philadelphia with $43 in her checking account and a classified pass that could never be acknowledged. But she didn't throw the dog tag away. Instead, her fingers found the chain beneath her shirt, and she held it for a moment, feeling the weight of 20 years and 9,000 miles and one 7-year-old boy who'd grown into a Navy SEAL and somehow, impossibly, had ended up in the exact hospital where she'd taken refuge. Coincidence was a thing for people who didn't understand how the world actually worked. This wasn't coincidence. This was purpose wearing the mask of chance, showing her that some threads, once started, could never really be cut. She was about to turn the key when she heard it, distant at first, then growing closer. The deep rhythmic thump of rotor blades cutting through the rain-soaked night sky. She lifted her head, listening to the sound grow louder, coming closer to the hospital. Helicopter traffic wasn't unusual for Seattle General, but something in the tone of this approach, the precision of the flight path, made her sit very still. The rotors grew louder. The sound moved directly overhead, and the parking garage lights flickered as the aircraft circled the hospital helipad. And then everything changed. The rotors came first, a thunder that shook the windows on the 4th floor, rattling the metal blinds like bone chimes. The Black Hawk descended through the pre-dawn gray, its landing gear locked, the rotor wash peeling rain off the helipad and sending it sideways across the glass. 6 figures rappelled down before the aircraft even settled, combat boots hitting concrete in synchronized formation. Rifles slung. Armor plates gleaming. They moved like predators who'd forgotten how to walk, fluid, economical, terrifying. The hospital administrator's voice crackled through the PA system at 05 for 7 hours, stammering so badly the first 2 words came out as one sound. Rachel Torres, report to the roof immediately. All personnel clear the helipad. This is not a drill. Nurses stopped mid-stride in the hallway. And 4 drip hung suspended in someone's hand. Dr. Ashford, standing near the nurse's station reviewing discharge notes, looked up from his tablet. His face was still, but his fingers tightened on the device's edge. Something in his chest had begun to calculate the angles of a problem he couldn't yet articulate. Rachel was in the stairwell when she heard her name. She didn't run. She climbed with the measured pace of someone who'd already survived the worst the world could offer and was simply walking toward it again. Each step echoed in the concrete space, a heartbeat, a countdown, a door closing on one life and opening onto another. She'd known this moment would come. She'd just never believed it would come here, in scrubs, in a hospital where she'd tried so hard to be small. The helipad door opened to wind and noise and the smell of aviation fuel. The rotors were still turning, not slowing, not powering down. This was a tactical insertion, not a casual pickup. The 6 operators stood in a line, and at their center stood Commander James Hewitt. His left arm was in a sling. His eyes, the same eyes she remembered from a traumatized 7-year-old boy in a field hospital outside Ramadi, locked onto hers. He nodded once. Recognition. Respect. The greeting of warriors who'd walked the same fire. Behind him stood a 3-star admiral in dress blues, his face carved from decades of command decisions. He held a tablet in both hands like an offering or an indictment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of classified briefings and decisions made in rooms without windows. Major Rachel Torres, he said, and her actual name fell into the space between them like a detonation. Army Special Operations Combat Medical. Your orders have been reinstated effective immediately. We need you for deployment. Wheels up in 1 hour. The SEAL team leader stepped forward. His name tape read Holloway. He was tall enough that Rachel had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes, and when he spoke, each decoration fell from his mouth like a judgment. Silver Star. First Tour, Helmand Province, 2006. Pause. Silver Star. Second Tour, Mosul Corridor, 2009. Pause. The wind pulled at his uniform. Defense Superior Service Medal. Classified Operation Sanborn, 2014. You saved 47 lives in 72 hours. 47. He stepped closer. An accommodation from JSOC that's still so classified we can't read it aloud. But the general knows. The admiral knows. And every operator in this formation knows you're the reason they're standing here breathing. Rachel's voice, when it came, was steady as a held breath. What's the mission? But she wasn't looking at the Admiral. She was looking past him, down through the glass partition to the floor below, where Dr. Ashford had stepped into the hallway. His tablet had slipped from his hands. It hung from his wrist strap, forgotten. His face was draining of color in real time, blood retreating from his features like a tide going out and never coming back. Because standing beside the Admiral was an FBI agent in a dark suit, and beside her was another, and between them they were spreading printouts across the administrator's desk like a tarot reading of ruin. Rachel could see the angle of Ashford's shoulders change, the moment his instinct told him the gravity of what was about to unravel. The documents were personnel files. Surgical reports. Death certificates. 3 of them. The dates were highlighted. The cause of death columns were highlighted. And in the margins, in careful administrative handwriting, were notes that Dr. Ashford had never meant anyone to find. 15 years. The FBI agent's voice carried through the stairwell, calm and lethal as a scalpel. 15 years of falsifying patient records. 3 deaths blamed on nursing staff. One of those records showed Rachel's signature, forged. Another showed a nurse named Marie Chen, fired for negligence she'd never committed. The third showed James Okonkwo, who'd left nursing entirely, his career obliterated, his confidence shattered by an investigation that was built on lies. Ashford's mouth moved. No sound came out. Rachel turned back to the Admiral. The helicopter rotors hadn't stopped. They were waiting for her. "I need 3 minutes," she said. "You have 90 seconds, the Admiral replied. She took the stairwell down 2 steps at a time. The ICU was in chaos, orderlies and nurses clustered around doorways, watching the helipad on phone screens, trying to piece together what was happening. Rachel moved through them like current through water, invisible. She stopped at Hewitt's bed. He was awake, would always be awake now, alive because of an improvised chest seal and hands that remembered their training better than her mind remembered how to be human. "Stay alive, Commander," she said. "Come back, Major," he replied. The words weren't a request. They were a command. An order from one soldier to another across the battlefield they called civilian life. She nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the door. The hallway was empty now except for one figure. Ashford stood in the corridor between the ICU and the administrative section, and his eyes had the quality of a man watching his own execution. His mouth worked. The words came fractured. "You can't, this is a mistake, I was only protecting patient." "Step back," Rachel said. Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave. It had picked up the tone of someone who'd given orders under fire, who demanded absolute obedience in conditions where hesitation meant death. Ashford stepped back. He didn't mean to. His body simply obeyed the frequency of command it recognized. The helipad was waiting. The rotor wash grabbed her hair and tore it loose from its bun, and it didn't matter because she wasn't Rachel the temp nurse anymore. She was Major Torres. She was the operator who'd walked into Ramadi with a rucksack and a suture kit and walked out having changed the mathematics of survival for 47 people. She strapped into the seat beside Hewitt. The Admiral sat across from her, nodding once with the look of a man who'd just retrieved a piece of the world that had been missing. The helicopter lifted. Philadelphia fell away beneath them, the parking lots, the concrete, the building where she'd spent 6 months trying to be invisible. She watched the hospital shrink through the open door, watched a figure in a dark suit emerge onto the helipad with 2 other agents, watched them escort Dr. Ashford into the stairwell with the careful choreography of an arrest. 6 months later, Rachel was wheels up from Pope Field, bound for somewhere with a name she couldn't speak and a mission she couldn't explain. She was wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 20 years, the collar felt like a promise she'd made to herself about never hiding again. Hewitt's dog tag hung on a chain around her neck, resting against her sternum, beating with her heart. Next to it hung her own tags, the weight of her actual identity finally returned to her. And somewhere in Philadelphia, through the window of a strip mall insurance office on a street with no trees, Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table beneath fluorescent lights that flickered like a heartbeat losing rhythm. The name tag clipped to his shirt read Steve in handwriting that wasn't his own. He flinched when clients approached. He no longer introduced himself with a title. His license was gone. His credentials were ashes. His testimony in the malpractice hearings had put him in front of 3 civil juries, who'd watched him stammer and sweat and try to explain the unexplainable. Rachel didn't slow her stride as she passed the window. The glass reflected her image, major in dress uniform, dog tags visible, the look of someone who'd just been restored to herself. But it also reflected something else, the hollow eyes of a man staring back from his own reflection, watching her disappear, understanding finally that he'd spent 15 years building his own prison out of lies and now he was serving the sentence. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Like and subscribe to keep watching untold stories of hidden heroes. And tell us, if you'd survived what Rachel did, would you have ever come back?